This is a story about land use and resource management. It explores the past and looks at the future of sustainability, development, and conservation. The idea of a common pool resource has been around for hundreds of years but has changed dramatically over the recent times. This idea, to some, is a fallacy.
Well, like I mentioned, the oceans, sure, that's sort of common territory, but if you're a big corporation and you can afford these big trolling boats, you're going out and getting way more than your fair share. Other people don't have the resources to be able to go out and get it. So it's the big moneyed people that can go out and get it.
And that's the biggest threat, you think, to the concept of common pool resource as far as in modern days?
I don't know that there is a threat because it never was common. So I think the threat itself is illusionary. And when you come to think of, I want to go fishing on this river here and catch some bass and some trout, I can't do that without getting a license from the state.
The best way to do it, in my mind, is to have two different license sets. The recreational license set, where you're allowed to fish for X amount of fish, and the industrial license set, where you're allowed to fish for a different number of fish.
The Salmon Falls Intertribal Hunting and Fishing Pact, where common pool resources were shared for all within 1 day's distance from the site of the treaty, also encouraged other relationships to be built. Agreements, contracts, and treaties are social constructs that allow for the peaceful settlement of disputes, long-range relationship building, and mutual security of all involved parties.
All right, so let's start with a basic explanation of what common pool resources are. People are familiar with private ownership. You know, this pipe is mine, your house is yours. And you have a sense of, I bought this, here's the boundaries of it, I can decide what I want to do with it. A common pool resource is one where usually an individual does not own that resource, but many people have access to it. So for instance, you and I are standing here, we're both breathing the air. I don't own it, you don't own it, but we're both utilizing it. So that's a common pool resource. The water that's right behind us here is a common pool resource because neither of us own it, but many people use it for a lot of different purposes, for fishing, for swimming, for hydroelectric power. You've got the sky, the ocean, the fish that swim in the oceans, all common pool resources. So if you think of the common pool resource as something that that individuals don't own, but we all take from or use, that's a good definition of it. There are also common pool resources that do have an ownership aspect to it. So for instance, if we're in a town park or a national forest, we're in land that has definite boundaries and it's owned by the federal government or by the town government. But once again, many people who don't particularly own it have a right to access it and use it.
So can common pool resources become overused or overexploited by particular individuals or entities?
Well, and of course they can. And in fact, in 1968, Garrett Hardin wrote an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, which went through this process. And what he looked at were the old traditional commons in England, where everyone was allowed to bring their animals to graze on the commons, which was a big park-like area, just like we have here in New England, as grazing land for their sheep or their cattle or whatever they had. And since no individual owned it, it was to their advantage to get all their animals onto the commons to use that grazing land. Well, if everyone does that, then you have a situation where the grazing land is actually destroyed. The same applies to fish in the ocean. No one owns the fish, except the fishermen who run out and snag them in order to sell them to make a profit. Well, if every fisherman runs out to bring up as much cod as they can to sell them, you have the problem that the cod stocks are depleted. So a lot of the tragedy is very, very location specific, I should say. Right now, we have this common pool resource behind us, and I live on the river, and I see people swimming in it all the time, fishing in it all the time. We see another competing use, the hydroelectric dam, down the ways a little bit, and yet there's still enough water in it, maybe overused just because of human nature. If I get there first, no one else gets it. Other times they're not. And so that leads to the question of how do you manage common pool resources so that everyone who feels they have a right to access them and use them can do so without hurting it for the next person who comes along.
So where is the balance between private and public interests? Are laws sufficient to protect both, or will they simply deepen the divides that have become so politically polarizing?
Well, our values have changed so much, and we've become so greedy and so involved in what we feel we deserve that we're forgetting a very common thing that we should be valuing, which is the earth and all the things in it. And I think we forget how these things are relevant to us. This is much more than a money thing, This is much more than an economic thing. This is much more than it has nothing to do with that. And that's just what I'm saying. People have to realize that it's separate, and we've lost track of that,
One thing for sure is that popular perceptions are changing about values and what it really means to be a functional community, especially in times when uncertainty seems to be the new norm. So, where are our cultural trends leading? Will preservation and protection prevail over profits and prosperity? Or will people and planet be consumed by greed and self-interest? The balance seems so far off, but action and awareness can pave the way for new solutions to be discussed, which are fair and equitable for this generation and those who follow our examples.
Paid a little extra for the backland, but what it meant was we had, a single frontage lot, but about 80 acres, and we continued to add to it when funds became available. Basically, that was the reason we named it Masson Ridge, is because the money did become available from my grandfather, and we knew we had in mind to do some conservation, and I showed it to one land trust, but they were more dealing with agriculture, so it turned to another one, Mount Grace. We walked out here, I showed them everything that I had sort of come to know. We went into the sort of some of the details about how, what the conservation restriction would look like, and it became clear that it was probably better to conserve this land as an intact ecosystem and not as a working landscape. which is what most people will do, is, conserve land with a restriction that just simply keeps it out of development. But we went a step further to preserve it from all forms of imposed or extraction and changes that kind of man-made interventions. So, except for the part that we're on right now, this is a resource area, so-called, so we can get firewood and we can get lumber if we want. We haven't done it, but we could. But the idea is just that this land needs a rest. It's been worked over a couple of times. Most recently, 22 years ago, they logged it pretty heavily. And you can, not all of it. I mean, what you're looking at right now is doesn't show the signs of it so much, but you see a stump over there. But there are places where, it's just one stump after another. And we're trying to get some regeneration. We see the problems that conservationists everywhere are facing in the Northeast with invasives and with heavy deer browsing, and with possibly some depletion issues from the removal of the biomass and the minerals that go with the biomass when they take wood out. It somewhat depletes the soil. So we're trying to just help things recover, and in the process study it, use the primary resource of this land being educational, rather than extraction of any kind of a physical resource. It's more of the educational resource that we look at.
I would say that my politics are based on bioregionalism, and that I would like to see local control based on watersheds, that we could divide ourselves up based on watersheds. I think we'd have a new way of looking at ownership and stewardship. Okay? So we obviously know we need to move away from a centralized economy. It's killing the planet. It's killing off vital resources for our survival. 100 species a day are going extinct, and we're just not going to be able to survive at the rate that we're going. So one way that we can decentralize is by redefining our local regions, redefining where we get the things that we use and how we deal with the waste that we create. And some of these new forms of thinking are a deeper form of ecology than the original social ecologies that look at nature as a series of resources for humans. In order to really survive for any length of time, we need to redefine that and think of ourselves as part of the environment that we live in. Bioregionalism and other ways of codifying these ideas are some of the ways that we can do this, that we can decentralize, break out of a centralized oil economy into a local economy, and the scale of the things that we engage with will ratchet down and be more in line with the ways that we want to live. So if things stopped, if the trucks and the trains and the planes stopped bringing foods and supplies from all over the world, we would have to make certain changes. Why not make those changes now, before it's too late, before it's impossible to make these changes? Why not use the bones of the existing economy to build a new one that's based on an environmental ethic that respects all life and that reintegrates us with our natural environment?